Hi everyone, welcome to OzTube number 2. To be honest, I'm still not entirely sure how I'm going to be handling this. I guess what I'll probably do is, since I didn't really do much of that in my first video, and I realized that afterwards, I guess I'm going to do a little bit of intro on me, and then we'll start talking about The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Thanks to everyone who commented and watched the first one. I hope you're sticking around for more. I guess we'll start a little bit with me. My name is Garrett. I assume most of you who watched that already know this. I have been a fan of The Wizard of Oz since about 1989, 1990. It was in that 50th anniversary of the MGM film time frame. And it started because I saw the movie. Like a lot of people, it started because I saw the movie, particularly my generation. And I was at that age. It seems from my friends and people I've talked to that their big obsessions generally form around the age of 4 to 5. And I think part of what really captured Oz with me was at that time there was that huge marketing media toy blitz with multi-toys. And Oz was everywhere over every toy store we were in. So it was a lot of Oz, and that was what did it for me, was that just sort of helped solidify it. And I read the book for the first time when I was in the second grade. I was about 8. And I knew there were differences, because I had by that point seen both the 1982 animated version and the 1987 animated version, which have elements from the books. And so I already knew things were different from the movie. And so I read Wizard, and then I'd read several of the others throughout elementary school up through early middle school. And I think that was the last time I read an Oz book that wasn't a reread. Until now, obviously. So that was kind of where I started, and the obsession sort of grew to what it is now. So I will always love the movie. The movie is one of my favorite aspects of the Oz world. But that doesn't mean I'm only the movie. I generally like just about anything tied to Oz, as long as it's well done. Like, I don't really care for Oz the crappy and misogynistic, because as you'll kind of see as we go through the books, they're completely at odds with what Baum intended. I actually really enjoyed Emerald City on NBC the other night. I highly recommend it. I will say it is a darker Oz. It is an adult Oz. A lot of people were bent out of shape over the brief sex scene that I realized it was a sex scene, but it took me a minute or two to realize that's what that was, and then by the time I realized that's what it was long over. More shocking to me were some of the brutal deaths. And I'm loving the introduction of other Baum things. Like, we've already met Mombi and Tip and Jack. Oh, he's not a pumpkin head, but that's okay. And I'm really intrigued and excited to see where they're going to go with this. And I love the visual world, so I'm all for Emerald City. Alright, so I guess we will kind of dive right into it. Those of you who are reading it along with me, please feel free to ask me any questions. I will answer them at the start of every video. Those of you who watch my floss tube know that I do that. Those of you who don't watch my floss tube or are new to me, please, any questions, any thoughts you have, throw them out. I'm always willing to discuss things. Because that works best for me, I believe. So, Wonderful Wizard of Oz, again, I'm using the Books of Wonder edition. Baum was amongst many other things, he was an entertainer. He was a fairly successful actor and playwright until his theater burned down. He tried to run a general store, a newspaper. He, in general, he liked to entertain. And one of the things he did at nights was he told stories to his sons and the neighbor children. And his wife, Maud, who I think largely was the inspiration behind Glinda, pushed him to put them all down in a book. And he eventually did. And that became The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. The publisher at first didn't... I think it was George M. Hill. That's what sounds right. Now I'm questioning myself. And I don't have a copy handy. Let's see, Yeah, George M. Hill. Haha. George M. Hill. They weren't too keen on publishing it because they thought it was good, but they didn't think it would sell, and it was going to be expensive because of all of the color and artwork throughout. So Baum, who had had a huge success with a book called Mother Goose and Prose, Father Goose and Prose, waived all his rights to that and put up the money himself to publish Wizard. And it was an immediate hit. And a lot of it is, Oz is our only American fairy tale. It was the first really American fairy tale. I mean, when you look at it in terms of children, young adult literature, there's Little Women, there's Huck Finn, there's Tom Sawyer, but those aren't fantasy. They aren't a fairy tale. They're just very, very good stories. And so Baum, in his introduction, which I'll read to you, kind of sets up part of what he wrote Oz for, and why he was telling this to his kids. Folklore, legends, myths, and fairy tales have followed childhood through the ages. For every healthy youngster has a wholesome and instinctive love for stories, fantastic, marvelous, and manifestly unreal. The winged fairies of Grimm and Andersen have brought more happiness to children's hearts than all other human creations. Yet the old-time fairy tale, having served for generations, may now be classed as historical in the children's library, for the time has come for a series of new wonder tales, in which the stereotyped genie, dwarf, and fairy are eliminated, together with all the horrible and blood-curdling incident devised by their authors to point a fearsome moral tale to each tale. Modern education includes morality, therefore the modern child seeks only entertainment in its wonder tales, and gladly dispenses with all the disagreeable incident. Having this thought in mind, the story of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was written solely to pleasure children of today. It aspires to be a modernized fairy tale, in which wonderment and joy are retained, and the heartaches and nightmares are left out. And that's very largely true. As we'll sort of see as we discuss through the first 6 chapters? First 7 chapters. The strong, frequent undercurrent is that the book is a tale in populism. The populist movement believed in a silver standard as well as a gold standard, so the silver shoes versus the yellow brick road, so the shoes are trampling down the gold standard. The wizard is meant to represent William Jennings Bryan, Dorothy represents the farmer, the Wicked Witch of the West, the rising powers of the Western influence. The poppy field is meant to be all the problems in Asia that William Jennings Bryan was hung up on. The winged monkeys are meant to be the Native Americans. On and on and on and on and on. And you can read that into it if you so choose. But the thing that struck me when I started rereading these is that introduction. And I think that's really the way to be reading this book, is that it is a modern fairy tale. And yes, there are going to be correlations to the things outside in the world, but they aren't necessarily going to be quite so cut and dry parallel. And I've always kind of felt that and gone back and forth. And I think the introduction, particularly the fact that he's striving for the modern fairy tale and the things that you're going to see as you go through the book, really influence that. So, what I've done for each chapter in my little spiral notebook is the chapter number and title, where it's located, because some of the chapters cover more than one location, and the characters who are introduced. Not necessarily the characters who are in the chapter, but the characters that have been introduced. Some of the chapters have a lot more discussion than others. And if you're following me on Goodreads, I am trying to sort of sum up my nightly reading with a thought. And then there will be more here. But I am doing this on Goodreads, too. So, yes. Alright, so chapter 1 is the cyclone. Location, Kansas, and technically the sky. Or wherever the area is between Oz and Kansas. And we meet Dorothy, Toto, Aunt Tim, and Uncle Henry. The basics are all there. It lays out that Dorothy lives in the middle of the great Kansas prairie. Everything is gray because the sun has just blistered everything to death. It's not, I don't believe, literally meaning gray, as a lot of interpretations would have you think. But everything is sort of just sun-bleached. There's not a lot of vibrancy. They live in a one-room house. It has a stove, a table, a pantry, I would assume, probably a cupboard, a bed for Aunt Tim and Uncle Henry, a bed for Dorothy. They probably Dorothy probably has one probably small bedside table with a drawer, and Aunt Tim and Uncle Henry probably have a dresser. And Dorothy probably only has a couple of dresses. That's about it. There's probably, of course, the washing stuff. I would assume there is a little more to the barn, because it's got stalls for the cows and the horses. But they're pretty poor. They're basically living off what they have and what they're able to grow. Which is part of why the cyclone must have been, or was so devastating. And the narrative of the story, of course, follows Dorothy, which, in the fairy tale tradition, Dorothy must be removed from her home, her family. Either in fairy tales, the main character, either their mother, because the mother is the protector figure, either dies, or, as is the case of Dorothy, or the Darling children, or they're taken away from them, and that's how they're able to learn and grow, because if the mother's figure is there is no reason for them to grow, because the mother is there to protect them, so they can stay a child. This is ultimately why in Harry Potter, for those of you who have read the Harry Potter books, and if you haven't, spoiler alert, why Dumbledore has to die. Dumbledore must die so that Harry can conquer Voldemort. Dorothy must be out of Kansas in order to learn what she has inside of her. That is rooted throughout all of fairy tale and folklore. So the cyclone had to have been devastating. My assumption is, because the stove is gone, that probably Aunt Tim and Uncle Henry had some stuff put away in cans that they were able to live off of. There's no real mention of neighbors. I assume there probably were. It does say that the lumber had to be carried many, many miles. That doesn't necessarily mean that there are no neighbors. It just, Baum doesn't tell us. And really, we're not concerned with Aunt Tim and Uncle Henry in this. We're concerned with Dorothy, and will Dorothy get back there? So, the set of events is all started by, of course, the cyclone appearing. Uncle Henry goes to the barn to free the livestock. Aunt Tim goes into the cellar, which is in the middle of there's a trapdoor in the middle of their floor that leads to the cellar. Aunt Em gets in. Toto, being frightened, runs and hides under Dorothy's bed. And in Dorothy's attempt to get him back, she does not make it to the cellar. And so, really, Toto is pretty much the entire reason all of this happens. So, Cyclone may be the inciting kind of thing. It's the catalyst. But Toto is the beginning. Toto is the reason. And as you'll see throughout the book, Dorothy will do what she has to protect Toto. Toto is really responsible for the line joining the group. He's responsible for the death of the Wicked Witch, the discovery of the wizard. Toto is really and truly probably the most important plot character to the book. So, things we'll see as we come along. So, tornado comes, carries Dorothy away. That's day one. There's no real determination of how long Dorothy is in the tornado. I'm going to assume that by the time she gets to Oz, it's morning of the next day. So it's probably just overnight. So, Chapter 2 brings us to Oz. The Council with the Munchkins. We meet the Good Witch of the North. We meet 3 unnamed Munchkin gentlemen. And we meet the Wicked Witch of the East, sort of. The location, of course, is Oz. It's Munchkin country. We're in the eastern land of Oz. And this is where you start to see Baum's humor. The cyclone is very much, here is Dorothy, here is Uncle Henry, here is Aunt Em, Kansas is gray, bam, there's a tornado. Dorothy takes a nap on the bed. So the first time you really get to see some of Baum's humor, and the now I can't find. I didn't start marking my page numbers until after this point. On page 20, it starts with, the cyclone had set the house down. Very gently for a cyclone. You get these little peppery bits of... Peppery's not the right word, but you get these little bits of sort of asides, like... And I love those. And I think that's one of the things. Baum is big on puns. Baum is big on wordplay. And you'll see that throughout. There are some antiquated terms. I don't notice too many of them. One of them is greensward, which is grass. I tried in some of these to look and see when did they fall out of vogue, when did they stop being used, and I definitely couldn't find some of that, so I just gave up trying. The interesting thing is Baum gives almost no description of Dorothy. So we get very vivid descriptions of what the Munchkins and the Good Witch of the North are wearing. I mean, there's a paragraph on that covers what they're all wearing. We do get a little bit of description of Dorothy's Dorothy's clothing, but no description of her hair color, her skin tone, and I think that speaks to Baum. Most people probably read it that because of the movie that Dorothy is white with brown hair and brown eyes and, looks like Judy Garland. But really, Dorothy can be read to be anything you want her to be. And that's, I think, a real testament to Baum himself, is that he's very, very careful, really throughout the entire series, to never discuss skin tone. And that's, I think, part of what makes the book so modern still, is that these characters could be any race you want them to be. Oz is completely multicultural, and I think that's fantastic. On page 23, again, if this is the facsimile edition, the Witch of the North states that she is not very powerful. That the reason the Munchkins were enslaved, well, I wasn't as powerful as the Witch of the East. She'll reiterate that again when Dorothy asks her to send her home. I personally kind of think that's a little bit representative of Dorothy at the beginning. She doesn't have the ability to get herself home. I think this is much more the case with the MGM Dorothy, which is the case of why Glinda being merged into the two characters works. That's kind of a discussion for its own when I eventually do discuss the MGM film. One of the things I also like in the books is that everyone is very matter of fact. There is no hidden meaning to what anyone tells you, at least so far. Now, obviously, I'm sure the wizard will prove me wrong with that. But you can take everyone at face value. And that's Baum subverting the fairy tales. There's not the trickster character. There's not the deceiver character. There's the trickster character. The hero's journey does apply to Oz. That's its own thing. We're not going to get into that. Just not going into the hero's journey at this point in time, at least. I may later, but as of now, I'm not. But there's no one with an ulterior motive. They're very straightforward, very matter of fact. Oz is interestingly considered to be uncivilized, which is very interesting when you later start learning more of the political, the way that Oz's political system, their economic system, the more and more you'll read, and it doesn't show up as much in Wizard as it does in later books, but Oz is significantly more civilized than America is. Just gonna say it. And I think that Baum, again, uses a lot of irony. And I think he means that in an ironic way. And it's interesting because the Witch of the North says, in civilized countries, I believe there are no witches left. Nor wizards, nor sorceresses, nor magicians. But you see, the land of Oz has never been civilized, for we are cut off from all the rest of the world. Therefore, we still have witches and wizards among us. Dorothy then asks who are the wizards, and the witch only replies about the great and wonderful Wizard of Oz. There is at least two other wizards, but they're not really talked about. There are definitely more witches per capita than wizards per capita. I don't know why. And I think that's because Baum, and that's ultimately something you'll see as well, Baum is very definitely a feminist. His mother-in-law was essentially Susan B. Anthony's second-in-command. She big in the suffragette movement, and Baum was very big for it as well. So you'll see ultimately that in general, the women hold the majority of the power in Oz versus the men. Let's see. So then, of course, so Dorothy's explaining to the Witch of the North. There's discussion about where she's from, and then all of a sudden the Munchkins, who've been fairly quiet, start freaking out because the Witch of the East, who is squished under Dorothy's house, and everyone believes her to be a sorceress because of the house dropping on the witch. Everyone believes her to be a sorceress because of this, because they've never seen anything like it before. They've theoretically never seen a tornado before. The witch just dries up in the sun. Which the Witch of the North just says, well, she was that old. She just dried up. So now Dorothy has the silver shoes, which she doesn't initially put on. She takes them inside her house. She then expresses her interest to go home, and she's told by all of them that she can't walk there because there is a great desert, and it surrounds Oz on all four sides. So the best thing Dorothy can do is go to the City of Emeralds, and we see our first real use of magic, if you don't count the whole drying up feet witch. when the Witch of the North puts her hat on her nose, spins it around, and it turns into a chalkboard that says, "Let Dorothy go to the City of Emeralds." It is referred to as City of Emeralds exactly twice, so far at least. I've been keeping track, because then it becomes Emerald City, and I don't know why there's this shift. I can't find any reason for it. But this is the first real bit of magic that Dorothy sees. The next bit comes when the Witch of the North kisses her forehead and tells her that she will keep an eye on her, and that the mark that's left behind from her kiss will protect her from danger. There are lots of interpretations, illustration-wise, of this kiss. Generally, once it's one of those things, the kiss is there, and when it's needed, it sort of glows and you can see it. But some illustrators, particularly Michael Haig, it's present all the time. And then the Munchkins leave, the witch spins around on her heel 3 times and disappears. Which is pretty powerful if you ask me, but then again, you're talking to someone who has no magical power, so really anything to me is more powerful. Toto freaks out, Dorothy's just like, eh. Dorothy is very, very much okay with magic. She does not think twice about it. There is no questioning it. She just goes, okay, that's what this is. I'm in a magic land. And I think it's very forward-thinking of her. I think it also points a little bit to about how old she probably is, that she's willing to just accept all of this at face value. My guess is she's under 10. There are some comments that she'll make later in the book that sort of suggest she might be younger than 10, but she's somewhere between probably 6 and 10. So chapter 3 is how Dorothy saved the Scarecrow. Begins along the Yellow Brick Road. We reach Buck's farm, and we reach a cornfield. And we meet Buck and his family and the Scarecrow. So this is day 2. We're on to day 2. Days 2 and 3 are covered in this. Dorothy is clearly old enough. She understands to fix herself breakfast. She changes her clothes into her nicest dress, which is a blue and white gingham dress. She wears a pink sunbonnet. That's kind of the end of the description of Dorothy's outfit. It's officially referred to as Emerald City for the first time on page 33. And then Dorothy sets off on her journey. And I love that she actually closes the door, locks it, and places the key carefully in her pocket. I love that. It's just there's a lot of these little cute details. And I think at the time, it's understandable. It's exactly what any of us would do. We assume we're coming back to our house. Maybe. Might as well lock it, protect it. So that's what Dorothy does. She protects her house. From what I understand, I did ask someone who has read more of the books than I have, we never see Dorothy's house again. She never returns to that spot. And it's kind of a shame. I feel a little bit like it's a missed opportunity. It's one of my favorite moments in Return to Oz when she discovers her old house. It's just sort of a nice little moment. Munchkin Country is clearly agricultural. Most of Oz is agricultural. Blue is the favorite color. I haven't done any research yet on color significance, but blue is their favorite color. Which is why the Munchkins are so favorable towards her. Not only the fact that she killed the Witch of the East, but she's wearing blue and white. White is the color of witches and sorceresses, and it's usually associated... White is usually associated with good. It's not clear if the witches of the East and West ever wore white. It's a tie-in to the suffragette movement, women in white voting. The implication is white is the color of good witches. Dinslow's illustration for the Witch of the West. Almost every other iteration of the characters I can find, the Witch of the West is not in white. Glinda and the Witch of the North generally are. So... that's I lost my train of thought. So, they view Dorothy, blue and white. She's a nice witch. She favors the Munchkins. So she comes across a farm. There's all these people coming out and sort of waving at her and smiling at her and thanking her, which has to be just surreal as heck. As she comes across this farm, big party, they invite her to stay the night. Everyone is fascinated by Toto. Toto is the only dog in Oz. Which, they're just all fascinated by him. Which is understandable, dogs are awesome. As she gets up, she spends the night, she gets ready to leave, and Bach warns her that the road to the Emerald City is not going to be always great. It's going to go through some not-so-safe areas, and to be aware of that. And Dorothy says, well, I gotta get home. I'm just going to have to do it. So, we've got Dorothy's first sign of courage. So she walks along the Yellow Brick Road, she decides to rest for a few moments, and that's where we finally meet the Scarecrow. The dialogue from this first encounter is almost verbatim in the MGM film. And Dorothy rescues him. He tells her he has no brains. They set off together down the Yellow Brick Road. Surprisingly, he's very coordinated. He's got very good motor skills for someone who's never walked before, apparently. And he says he only has two fears, being a fool and fire. But he clearly at least has common sense. If he's aware enough that fire is bad, then he's not as foolish as he thinks he is. And this is, again, one of the great uses of irony. He has a brain. He's really very smart. He just doesn't believe it. And that's where The Wiz takes its angle from The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, is it's about believing in yourself and realizing that you do have what you need all along. And that takes us to Chapter 4, The Road Through the Forest, where we finally enter the forest and we find the Tin Man's cottage. We meet, through the Scarecrow's story, the Munchkin farmer and his friend, as well as the Old Crow. Interestingly, there are potholes in the Yellow Brick Road. Scarecrow keeps tripping over them. He doesn't figure out to move around them. So he has some common sense, but not a lot. The Scarecrow, Dorothy tells the Scarecrow where she's from, and they have this sort of philosophical discussion about, well, why would you want to go back there when Oz is so beautiful? And Dorothy says, well, there's no place like home. That's where I'm from. And Scarecrow then has this nice little moment of empathy where he says, well, then I guess it's good that you have a brain, because then Kansas might be lonely if it didn't have people there. So it's good for Kansas. And it's just this nice little weird sort of moment, and you see that a lot. He relays the story of his creation. He's only 2 days old, which makes his motor skills even more impressive. Must be magic. And again, the magic in Oz is very natural. Baum was never concerned with, and this is something that, as I discussed with a friend, modern fantasy novels are very concerned with, this spell does this, this potion does this. In Oz, it just happens. The magic is just there. No one questions it. No one wants to know where it comes from. No one plans to create it. Sure, there are potions that get made and spells that get cast, but the emphasis is not on the casting or the physical spell, it's on what happens as a result thereof. It's more natural. So you'll see through the books, there are all these sorts of magical, otherworldly things that just happen that no one thinks twice about. And again, Baum's use of irony, he's a scarecrow who can't scare crows. The crows figure him out. So it's ironic. Here's this guy who his only job is to scare crows and he can't do it. So he decides to better himself by getting a brain because he wants to do better at his job. And that's a very human thing for this non-human entity. And there's a level of humanity that exists throughout all of these characters. So they go through the forest. It becomes nighttime. One of the things that we keep seeing is that Dorothy stops and eats. She eats at least once or twice a day. And I think that's very clearly Baum, again, subverting, Hansel and Gretel, Snow White, these characters who are lost and wandering and hungry. Baum never wants you to worry that Dorothy is not eating. He does want you to wonder, will she get home? But her basic needs are being taken care of. That's not something you have to worry about. So they find the Tin Woodman's cottage. Dorothy sleeps there, and the Scarecrow, because he doesn't sleep, just sort of watches over her. So chapter 5, again, the forest. We meet the Tin Woodman, we meet the Munchkin Maiden, and the Munchkin Maiden's mother. Now, the Munchkin Maiden has a name. It's Nimmy Amy. We learn more about her in a later book. So, let's skip. Scarecrow has a lovely bit of commentary. It must be inconvenient to be made of flesh, for you must sleep and eat and drink. However, you have brains, and it is worth a lot of bother to be able to think properly. Because Dorothy has said, well, I need to bathe, and I need some water, so that way when I eat some bread, it's not going to stick. And he's just like, well, that's a lot of fuss. But you have a brain, so I guess it must be worthwhile. So, let's see. So they meet the Tin Man. They oil him up. He explains that he just forgot to take his oil can. He asks how they came along because he's been there for a year, and they tell him, well, we're going to the Emerald City. And he says, well, do you think the wizard might give me a heart? And they say, well, why not? You might as well come along. And this turns out to work in their favor because there are fallen trees and debris, and the Tin Woodman's able to clear them up. So as they're traveling along, we get this lovely little bit of comedy where the Scarecrow trips. The Tin Man picks him up and goes, well, why didn't you walk around the hole? And he says, well, I don't know enough. My head is stuffed with straw, and that is why I'm going to ask Oz for some brains. It's like, finally, someone goes, really? Come on, there's a hole there. And the Tin Woodman starts to explain his backstory of why he wants a heart. And honestly, Tin Woodman kind of has a superhero origin story. It's very melancholy, and a lot of this book, there's a little bit of a melancholy overtone to it. The Tin Woodman is in love with a Munchkin Maiden. She is in love with him, but she lives with an old woman, her mother, who is very lazy and doesn't want her getting married and leaving her. So she barters with the Witch of the East, and it's this very almost Borscht Belty vaudevillian moment, which given Baum's history, that's not surprising, where the conversation, which is not printed, but is assumed to be, the old woman goes to the Witch of the East and says, I want you to do something about him, and the witch is like, well, what do you want me to do? And she's like, well, what'll you give me for it? And she's like, 2 sheep and a cow? What, 2 sheep and a cow for a spell? Really? You come at me with this? I don't really, that's terrible, I know. But it's that sort of, almost that vaudevillian aspect of this woman is trading 2 sheep and a cow to essentially have the Tin Man killed by a witch. That's kind of amusing to me. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm sick in the head, but I think that's hilarious. That this entire exchange, I mean, because usually in these fairy tales, and again, this is Baum subverting it, in fairy tales, it's, well, in the case of Rapunzel, sure, you can have some rampion, but you're going to give me the baby. As it's pointed out frequently, like in shows like Once Upon a Time, magic comes at a price. So here, the witch is like, sure, for 2 sheep and a cow. It's really not all that wicked, I guess. So the witch enchants the Tin Man's axe, and it starts chopping off body parts, and he goes to a tinsmith and gets them refitted. But eventually he's made entirely of tin, but he has no heart, so he's no longer in love with the Munchkin Maiden. And this doesn't bother him at first, until he's forced to be rusted because he forgot his oil can. And then he realizes that he does miss her, and that he misses being able to love. And as we'll see really throughout the book, specifically with him, it's not that he lacks heart. He has plenty of heart. He has sympathy. He cries later when he steps on a bug. It's that he thinks, foolishly, that you need a heart to love. He doesn't realize that, no, you don't. Love is not maybe symbolized by a heart, but that's not what love is. I also have to wonder through all this, why didn't he get a new axe? Unless axes just aren't that easy to come by. Dorothy gets a little selfish towards the end of the chapter, because the Scarecrow and the Tin Man are kind of debating which is better, a brain or a heart. And Dorothy thinks that she doesn't know which one's right, but if she could only get back to Kansas and Aunt Em, it did not matter so much whether the Woodman had no brains and the Scarecrow had no heart, or each got what he wanted. Which is kind of selfish. Which is why that's, I think, one of the moments that points that maybe she's a little bit younger than 8. Or younger than 10. This is the first time that she is worried about food, because the bread is nearly gone. So she's more concerned about that than she is about who gets what. Which is practical. Alright, so chapter 6 is the introduction is the Cowardly Lion. Again, locale is same as previous. She meets the Cowardly Lion. That's the only new character in this. There's not really a lot to say in this chapter. It plays out very much like the movie. They're walking along, the lion roars, Toto barks, Dorothy punches the lion. We discover that he's a coward. And again, we've got all this irony. We have a Scarecrow who can't scare crows. We have a Tin Man who wishes he had a heart, so he's made of metal but wants flesh items. And a lion who's scared. And all along all of this, we get to see them each showing that they've really got the things they've got, they just don't understand what it is that makes these things. Brains don't necessarily mean wisdom. Heart doesn't necessarily mean love. Courage doesn't necessarily mean not being scared. It's common throughout this. And then Dorothy has all of it and never says a word. Not a lot really happens in chapter 6 other than that. The lion doesn't really have much of a backstory at all. He's just afraid. Really, he's the weakest, probably, of the 3 friends in terms of character development. I think Baum didn't really always have an idea of how to write for him, which subsequently is why he's not as big a character in the later books. He and Dorothy are both absent from the Land of Oz. They're both mentioned briefly, but they're both absent. He does resurface in Ozma of Oz, but the Scarecrow and the Tin Man are written about much more frequently. And I think it's largely because they were probably the more interesting characters to write. Part of it also is the success of the 1902 stage musical. Where the Scarecrow and the Tin Man were huge hits. They were, for lack of a better term, they were the Sheldon and Leonard of the 1900s. Alright, so chapter 7 actually covers 3 days. Days 4, 5, and the end of day 4, and then all of 5 and all of 6. There's a lot that happens in this one. So much so that on page 77, Baum actually says, this was to be an eventful day for the travelers. So first they come across what they describe as a ditch, but sounds a little bit too deep to be a ditch. No real explanation for what causes the ditch. Oz topography is weird. But it's small enough that the lion goes, well, I could jump it. So they each take turns riding on the lion's back as he jumps over this ditch, showing courage. Then they encounter the Kalidas, also known as Kalidas. I've heard several different. Kalida was the way I heard it first. That's kind of the way I default to. But I don't think there is an official pronunciation. If there is, someone let me know. So they encounter the Kalidas, which are these giant beasts with the bodies of bears and the heads of tigers. And they are bloodthirsty. And they come across, after the first ditch, they come across a second ditch that's even bigger and even deeper. And the lion goes, yeah, there's no way I can jump over that. The scarecrow notices a big tree and says, hey, Tin Man, chop down that tree. We can just cross over the tree. Again, use of brain. Tin Man does so. And as they're crossing, the Kalidas appear. So Lion sends the others on ahead and says, I'll stall them. So he roars at them. Terrified as he is, he roars at them, which makes them pause, which gives the lion time to get out. And then they get across, while the Kalidas start following them across the tree, so the Scarecrow again says, Tin Man, chop down the tree. So he chops the tree, and the Kalidas fall into the ravine, and they are dashed on the rocks below. In fact, I think that's exactly the words used. Yep, both were dashed to pieces on the sharp rocks at the bottom. Now, of interesting note, for those using a color edition, up until now, it's been a blue-green color. Kansas was brown, this is blue-green. In the middle of the chapter, we get red for the poppy field that's coming up. Color change. And that was how the original book was printed, which is part of what made George M. Hill kind of leery of publishing it. Because that's a lot. That's a lot of money at that point. In fact, I believe the book sold for like $1.50, which was ridiculously pricey for a children's book. So then finally, after they get away from the Kalidas, they finally start to come out of the forest, and they reach a riverbed that the Elric Road continues on the other side of. Why there is no bridge, I don't know. That would make the most sense. Someone build a bridge. Why does the road neatly stop and then start again? But hey, I'm not in charge of the road system in Oz. If I was, though, I would fix that. So the Scarecrow says, well, we could build a raft and raft across it. And the man says, okay. And that's where it takes an additional day. So the start of the chapter, they spend the night in the forest. That's day 4. Day 5 is spent getting to the edge. And then at the end of that night, we get into day 6. That ends the first 7 chapters of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. My foot has fallen asleep. Moving my foot. So, that's kind of it for the first part of this. I'm enjoying reading the book. Not really entirely sure what to say here, so we're just going to kind of go with it. I promise this will get better once I figure out what I need to do and how. So if there are suggestions, throw them at me. I'm enjoying reading it. The book, it's very quick, so if you're not reading along and you'd like to, if this says anything, most audiobook versions of Wizard take between 3.5 and 4 hours. Even taking my copious notes, because I'm not even hitting all of my notes, even doing all that, I usually have the chapter read and done with in half an hour. If I weren't taking notes, I could probably read a chapter in about 10-15 minutes. So they don't take very long. So I highly suggest if you want to read along with me, please do. I believe at least all of the Baum books, probably a good portion of the Thompson ones, are probably available for free online, or for your Kindle, or your Nook, or, you can go to your library. If you have a used bookstore, I promise you can pick up a paperback copy of at least Wizard, if not several of the others, for just a couple of bucks. So they won't break the bank. And I know for sure at Barnes & Noble you can get the first 15 books in a compendium. or maybe 3 compendiums, but either way. So, strongly recommend it if you'd like to follow along with me. Next week, we will have read up through... Let's look chapter-wise. We'll have read through chapter 14. So, we will do The Deadly Poppy Field, Queen of the Field Mice, Guardian of the Gates, Wonderful Emerald City of Oz, The Search for the Wicked Witch, How the Four Reunited, and The Winged Monkeys. So essentially, we're going to get through the vast majority of the second act. If you break down the structure. So, Act 1 would end with the arrival in the Emerald City, and Act 2 will end with the departure of the wizard and his balloon. And I'm assuming if you're watching this, you know all of this stuff already. At least the basic plot line of the first book, so there aren't spoiler alerts. And if there are, what the hell are you doing watching this instead of reading the book or watching the movie and figuring it out and then coming back to me? Because I've spoiled a whole lot of stuff otherwise. Alright, so I think that's kind of it. Any questions, thoughts, please comment and throw them out there. If you have any suggestions on things you'd like to see me sort of do, I'd appreciate that. I have minimal video editing skills, so showing pictures and things, that's not always the easiest. I also don't have a scanner, so... yeah. There we go. So yes, feel free to throw things out that you'd like to see me do. So, on that note, I will see you all next week.